My mother-in-law invited me to a gala just to humiliate me. In front of 200 people, she called me stinky and laughed while the city's elite watched me crumble. She thought I was just a poor girl with dirt under my fingernails. What she didn't realize was that the very floor she was standing on, and the company that organized the entire event, belonged to me. She tried to make me small, but she was about to find out that she just insulted her own boss. Get ready, because what happened next changed our lives forever. It all started that night. It was just past 8 when he called me stinky in front of 200 people, like it was the funniest thing at the gala. The room froze mid-champagne, glasses suspended in half a toast, and every polite smile in a 3-mile radius sharpened into something that felt very much like permission to lynch me. My mother-in-law, Vanessa, leaned into the moment with a smile that had been practiced for years. She loved an audience. She loved even more making other people feel small. They laughed. I instead counted the seconds. AI. What they didn't know when she said it was that I owned the company that designed the terrace they were standing on. I owned the layout that made their photos flattering, the pavement that caught the light, the little beds of jasmine that sent that ghost of scent through the open doors. I owned the bronze plaque with the engraved dedication to the merger, my firm's name right above the logo of the lead investor. I had always been the person who showed up in muddy boots before noon and left with a smear of soil under my fingernails. "Stinky little sister," she said, loud enough for the room to orbit back to her. "You can either laugh when someone insults you, or you can count your options." I chose the latter because I was not there to win an argument in a ballroom. I was there to keep my father upright, to keep a marriage intact, and, quietly, to measure the people around me for what they were. The insult landed. The truth did not. That night, under the chandeliers and jasmine, I decided to let them keep the laugh. If this kind of story grabs you, hit subscribe. There's a full twist coming. We had been married 7 years. I had taken my husband's last name, learned the rituals of his family, and yes, at 25, I'd been shown the door by the woman meant to be the head of the family. It was a neat memory, like a photograph with the colors bled out. Vanessa standing in the doorway of the small apartment I'd rented, hands on her hips, telling me I didn't belong in his world. "Not your kind," she said, in that low voice that suggested charity more than cruelty. She had meant it as a warning. She had meant it as a verdict. For a while, I believed her. Then I started a company in the back of a coffee shop with 2 folding tables and a second-hand desktop that took 3 minutes to boot. I taught myself zoning codes and stormwater volumes. I learned how to read a soil report and what rock formations meant for a planting plan. I hired a woman who could draft at twice my speed, and a retired mason who'd been building steps longer than either of us had been alive. We signed our first municipal contract off a napkin, and my life changed in a slow, relentless way. Design became construction. Construction became a payroll. Payroll became an operation that supported 20 families, then 40. We bid a waterfront restoration that altered the skyline of a small city, won awards for stormwater mitigation, and, before I'd learned how to be unassuming, someone called us best in the region. I never announced it to the family. I had reasons. Vanity was one. Not giving Vanessa more ammunition was another. Mostly, though, I wanted to be loved for me and for the work I did, not for a balance sheet that could be flaunted and then picked apart in the same breath. So there I was, mid-gala, and the woman who used to tell me I didn't belong had just given the room permission to laugh at me. The sound of their laughter slid along the stone columns like a current. My husband, who had been standing next to her, looked at me as if he'd forgotten which country we were in for a second. He was excellent at forgetting. Harold, my father by marriage, though I always called him Dad, had been praised earlier from the stage as one of the company's founding partners. He was the man with the soft speech and a ready handshake. Tonight he stood beside Vanessa, smiling too broadly, hands trembling slightly at the champagne flute. That tremor in his fingers registered before anything else. People hide their failures in jokes. They hide their worry in grand speeches. The smile was rehearsed. The hands had, if you were trained to look for it, the easy tells of someone losing purchase on the script. I'd seen it before in a job site foreman who was about to lose a crew. The hands begin to betray the mouth. I caught Warren's eye across the crowded room. Warren Beckford had retired from investment banking the way some people retire to cramming a dozen houseplants into a tiny living room, hard, quiet, and with purpose. He'd been a mentor to me when I first broke into bidding on municipal projects, the kind of man who smuggled you a contact when the gatekeepers weren't looking. He was not the sort of person to make private comments in a crowded ballroom unless those comments mattered. He nodded once toward Vanessa and mouthed the sentence I didn't hear. He raised a finger and then, later that night, pulled me away and said things that would shift the axis of my life. "You need to be careful," he said, in a voice that had no place for secrets, but plenty of space for fact. "There's an examination underway into some of the holding companies tied to this family. Federal interest, not gossip." At the time, I heard the words, not the full weight of them. Federal interest. It could mean paperwork, it could mean audits, it could mean ugly headlines. I made 1,000 decisions in the 3 minutes between his warning and Vanessa's joke. I would not let them see me flinch. I would secure my father's finances quietly. I would not allow the people who had been cruel to me to be the same people who stole from the man I loved. When Warren said examination, he meant it. He had seen preliminary filings, a hint of the pattern, layers of transfers, shell companies that looked like plausible family businesses on paper, but evaporated if you tried to touch them. When I pressed him later for names, he was particular. "There's a direction that points back toward the management of the household accounts," he said. "Someone's been moving money around under a power of attorney." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. Vanessa's smile said as much as any document. I went home to the truck, to the ordinary. Biscuit, my cat, who lived like a tiny baron of mischief, rubbed at my calves and meowed like a small foghorn. I checked my phone for messages. There were 3, one from Rachel, my business attorney, flagged urgent for another matter, one from Frank, the PI I'd used once before when a construction partner pulled a disappearing act on a contract, and one from a number I didn't know that turned out to be Warren again. That night, I did the one thing I had learned to do when the stakes were bigger than my own pride. I turned my professional competence toward a family problem. I called Rachel first because I wanted to make sure my thinking had legal ballast. Rachel Park is the kind of attorney who smells like tidy offices and tells you the 3 worst-case scenarios before you finished your coffee. She listened to me on speakerphone in the dim truck, the hum of the engine keeping us company, and then said, "If you suspect elder abuse or financial manipulation, you bring in professionals who can document it in a way a court or a federal investigator will accept. You don't set traps. You don't make accusations. Document. Preserve evidence. That means receipts, bank statements, signed documents, notices of transfer." I told her about the tremor in Harold's hand, about the change in his checkbook behavior, about a conversation in which he had said, "I don't remember signing that." She did something mothers of logic do. She asked me to stop speculating and start collecting. "Find everything you can that he signed in the last 2 years," she said. "Check for a power of attorney document. If anyone's listed as agent, that's your starting point. I'll make some calls." Rachel's calm was a force. It was not dramatic. It was the steady undercurrent of a river that knew exactly which stones supported passage. She recommended Frank for the field work. Frank Moretti was a private investigator who smelled faintly of espresso and late-night stakeouts. He'd once found a subcontractor who'd gone on an unapproved vacation with a project's materials, and reliably, like many born and bent private eyes, turned up the missing ledger. Rachel told me Frank had a discreet style, and the patience of someone who'd watched evidence grow like a fungus under light. The first PI report came back in a thin envelope with a straightforward header and 3 lines that made my stomach plummet. Unauthorized transfers to an entity I had never heard of. A mortgage lien filed in the name of that entity against the title of my father's home. Life insurance proceeds diverted through a trust with signatures that looked wrong. The number on the bottom line of the page made me want to cry and check it again because it could not be real. $340,000, give or take, moved in ways that smelled of calculation. It was a lot of money in a small town. It was everything money looks like when it becomes a weapon. I don't want to say the discovery felt cinematic. This wasn't a movie with a swell of strings. But there was a precise voice in my head that narrated the next steps like a plan. Document, preserve, call the attorney, contact the bank, alert the proper authorities. Rachel advised against making any sudden moves that would tip off the person with power of attorney. She also advised that I secure immediate short-term remedies. Pay down the lien where possible to stop an imminent sale, set up conservatorship talk if Dad's cognition demanded it, get a temporary restraining order on accounts if necessary. There's a peculiar, clinical grief to learning that someone you were supposed to trust has been using legal tools, powers of attorney, trusts, shells, to take advantage of the very person they should have protected. That grief turned, in me, into a sharpened focus. I loved Harold. He had been kind to me in small ways. He called my mother when I first moved in with my husband to tell her he liked me. He remembered silly things like how I took my tea. Those small courtesies stack up across years. They become the scaffolding you stand on when something tries to topple you. I became methodical. I made inventory lists of documents. I asked Frank to pull bank statements, to do a historic analysis of wire transfers, and to check for liens and recorded instruments at the county recorder's office. He found an odd set of entries, transfers in batches, odd industry terms that suggested the money moved through a string of shell operations. Payments labeled as consulting and property upkeep that went to the same LLC, whose listed address was a mailbox at a UPS store. Frank also discovered that Vanessa had been listed as an agent on a durable power of attorney executed 18 months earlier. Harold's signature on the document looked, to my untrained eye, slightly shakier than his usual hand, and Frank flagged it. He didn't say forgery. He said anomalies consistent with cognitive decline and possible undue influence. It's important to say this plainly. The legal system takes a long time to move. Professionals like Rachel and Jerome Williams at the agency level, men and women who handle financial crimes, use different clocks. An attorney worries about precedent and admissible evidence. The FBI looks for patterns that tie to federal crimes. What we needed next was both: a legal strategy that would make the financial crimes prosecutable, and an investigative picture that would satisfy federal scrutiny. Warren, for his part, did what he could. He dug through his contacts and found a retired auditor who'd worked inside a brokerage and had an eye for irregularities in the books. He also lent me a folder of scanned corporate records he'd been accumulating, like someone who kept receipts just in case. Warren is the type of person who preemptively fears. He had, without telling me, started watching the edge of the map where my in-laws kept their finances. It was the kind of friendship that doesn't give up its favors cheaply. He balanced his disclosures between care and alarm, and when he showed me a list of shell entities that had appeared and vanished like ghosts behind family names, I felt the floor move under my feet. I could have stormed in screaming. I could have driven to the house and confronted Vanessa between her roses and glassware. Instead, I adopted a more useful posture. I played the role I'd been taught by years of being underestimated. I leaned in. I smiled on the phone. I sent bouquets with notes like, "Thinking of you," Because nothing disarms someone who expects triumph like unexpected politeness. I pretended to be a daughter who liked vanilla cake and sympathy and was willing to help balance accounts when needed. I logged every interaction. I saved voicemails. I recorded dates and times. Rachel told me how to do this, so it would be proper for court. Contemporaneous notes, sworn affidavits when applicable, and an evidentiary chain that left no room for a defense lawyer to tear at. There is a small, bitter joy in looking at a system you know you can navigate and using it to protect someone. My company, Fowle & Company, had the cash reserves to cover an emergency payment on a lien while we sorted the legal avenues. That's not a boast. It's a pragmatic detail. When your business is large enough to have breathing room, you can use that oxygen to protect other people. I wired the payment Rachel advised through channels she approved and had the finance team mark it to be reimbursed if we could prove the lien was fraudulent. It was again professional steps. Not dramatic, not cinematic, necessary. At night, between conference calls and reviewing Frank's notes, I'd sit with Harold on the back porch of his house. He'd watch the street, sometimes name every bird in the yard, sometimes lose the thread mid-sentence. He would pet Biscuit when the cat escaped our vigil, and then apologize as if the cat were a passive act of negligence. I would watch him trace the grain in the table the way people do when they have nothing else to do with their hands. I'd remind him of small, true things. The name of the mason who'd built the garden wall. The year the maple behind the garage was planted. He would answer with the smiles that had kept me falling in love with the family in the first place. Vanessa called sometimes to check on things. The calls were perfunctory, questions arranged in the tone of a woman who had the privilege of curiosity without the cost of empathy. She'd ask about the Gala, as if that one joke had been a victory. She never asked how Harold was sleeping. She never asked if he needed help with bills. Instead, she asked who we were inviting to the next dinner, like an MC planning a show. That's what made the betrayal visceral. Betrayal at a small scale looks like someone always taking a seat closest to the front and always choosing the piece of pie they liked best. Betrayal at a large scale looks like legal instruments used to shuffle money away from someone who can no longer guard it. The evidence grew. Frank found a canceled check written out to consulting services with Vanessa's signature in the margin. Bank wire confirmations showed funds leaving Harold's account to an LLC that on paper provided estate planning services. Rachel cross-referenced corporate filings and found that the LLC had a nominal director who lived in another state and had been appointed the day after Vanessa secured power of attorney. It was the sort of pattern that to a seasoned eye suggested a coordinated effort to centralize control. I set boundaries. I told my husband, because he was entitled to know, that I was not going to allow this to be a private family argument. We had to treat it like a legal problem. He was not a man of finance. His instincts were to defend family by force of loyalty. I asked him to read the reports. He did, with the slow look of someone whose map had been redrawn. He understood finally that loyalty without oversight is a door left open to anyone with the ability to step through. One night, Rachel said a sentence that had the weight of all the books she'd ever read about how the law catches people. If you want this to land in federal court, you keep the evidence pristine and you hand it exactly to the people who have jurisdiction. Any amateur theatrics, any personal acts that could be spun into creating a defense will only muddy a prosecutor's ability to get a warrant. We're not drama, we're verification. So we did what professionals do. Frank kept surveillance logs that read like weather reports, dry, accurate, dutiful. He watched patterns, times when Vanessa met with a particular bank manager, oddly timed withdrawals, moments when Harold seemed to sign papers with a hand that no longer tracked the loops he used to make. Warren supplied background, the kinds of notes an ex-investment banker keeps on people who make careers out of plausible deniability. Rachel filed motions, prepared draft affidavits, and set up emergency accounts for Harold that required 2 signatures and immediate oversight. The work of unmasking someone is tedious. You read signatures, you ask for original documents, you compare ink and paper and dates, you reconstruct months of transfers into a timeline that will show motive, opportunity, and, if you can make the case, intent. In my quieter moments, I'd stare at spreadsheets until the rows melted into one horizontal plane, and I could draw a line through the chaos to see the path of money. Sometimes I thought about calling Vanessa out at the next family gathering, bring a printed stack of the transfers, and spread them across the dining table like a hand of cards. Then I'd remember Rachel's voice. No theatrics. Professionals do not conduct ambushes in dining rooms. They build cases. There's a strange etiquette to feigning warmth when you're planning to expose someone. I sent Vanessa a card on her birthday. I complimented the roses she propagated around the fountain. I praised her contributions to the community garden at a public event. I listened to her tell me about the committee she chaired. I did all these things because someone who expects opposition will make different moves than someone who believes they've been forgiven. You can never underestimate how much people change their behavior if they believe they've convinced you they're still in charge. In private, I gathered my team. Rachel set up an emergency account for Dad. Frank showed me the first set of bank statements laid out in a way that made the transactions ugly and plain. Warren produced an auditor's note that flagged the same patterns we'd been seeing. I called Jerome Williams at the Financial Crimes Unit and left a message that was precise and devoid of melodrama. We have preliminary evidence of possible Eldo financial exploitation and related transfers that may fit your criteria. We're preserving evidence and would like to coordinate. He returned the call the next business day. Agent Williams's voice on the line was procedural but not uncaring. He asked questions that made my hair stand on end, because they were the kind of questions only someone who'd seen the pattern before would ask. Were their transfers consistent with shell entity payments? Were there persons exercising power of attorney benefiting from the transfers? Are the monies leaving the state? Yes, yes, yes. He didn't say when he would appear. He said he would need our paperwork to be clean and suggested that we let the professionals do what professionals do. He made it clear. Federal agents do not like surprises that make cases unprosecutable. They like documents, witnesses, and chains of custody. That's when I started preparing the controlled exposure. Not an ambush, but a carefully orchestrated reveal that would not violate the legal lines Rachel and Jerome had drawn. We would not bait or entrap. We would instead give Vanessa the appearance of normalcy while we quietly completed the legal scaffolding that would let investigators do their job. There was a practical side to this strategy. Vanessa loved family dinners. She loved being the hostess who could charm every guest into applause. The terrace where the gala had been held was mine to call on. My company had designed it, and I had the inside track on who would sit where and what would be said. If there was a place to show her to the light we had found, a dinner at a familiar table would do that. I wanted to expose the ledgered truth in front of the people who had once been the audience for her jokes. But I also wanted professional eyes on the scene when evidence was to be discussed. We set up a plan that was equal parts patience and immobility. Rachel instructed me to let the institution with jurisdiction take custody of any documents that would be used in a warrant. Jerome advised synchronization with the broader investigation into the shell entities so that we wouldn't cross wires and spoil a larger federal net. Frank kept watching. Warren double-checked bank routing numbers and traced corporate addresses. And while all that was being arranged, I played the most difficult role of all, the dutiful daughter who had always wanted to fix things. I told Harold that he was safe. I paid off the fraudulent lien on his house so the auction notice would be quashed. I established a short-term trust in his name, with an independent trustee Rachel vetted and approved. I hired a caretaker to monitor his bills and medications. The money I used was company cash, moved through proper invoices and council-reviewed transfers. Everything was recorded. Everything had a reason. There would be no stray drafts in this book we were building. Acting supportive has costs. It required patience and, at times, performing affection toward the woman who had once kicked me out. I made small talk on the phone, asked about recipes, complimented the roses, inquired about committee meetings. I told her, in a tone that made no promises, that I wanted peace in the family. She, in turn, returned to her practiced smiles and occasional thin kindness. She took my calls. There were nights when I pictured a much meaner version of myself, the one who would stand up in front of the congratulatory crowd and throw down the folder of evidence like a gauntlet. I imagined the gasps. I imagined her face going pale. I imagined everyone suddenly aware of the holes in the life Vanessa had purchased with small pieces of Herald security. But that would have been revenge, and the point was never to get revenge. The point was to restore what had been taken. I wanted to make sure Harold had the dignity of the truce and the security of a bank account that couldn't be siphoned each month. I wanted to make sure he'd be cared for on the schedule he deserved, not at the convenience of someone who chose to exploit him. Days blurred into lists of things to do. Frank delivered a wall of paper and digital files that needed sifting. Rachel held my nerves with lists and practicalities. Warren checked in with a folder that smelled faintly of his old office, a scent I now associate with late nights and good counsel. Jerome eventually acknowledged receipt of the packet we put together and suggested a coordination call the week of the dinner. We set a date for the family dinner. I made the guest list. By that point it felt more like an operation than a social calendar, and ordered the menu to be harmless. Roasted vegetables, a modest roast, a birthday cake I picked because Vanessa liked the way the frosting caught the light. We would be public enough to let others see her, and quiet enough to let the professionals move at the proper moment. On the night before the dinner, I went alone to the riverfront site my team had been restoring for the better part of a year. The project had been a long fight with zoning and permits, and there was a water feature we'd built, a skin of moving water that trickled into a shallow basin, reflecting sky like a small, patient mirror. I stood with my boots on the edge of the project, feeling the spray on my face. It was comfortingly ordinary. The smell of wet stone and new mortar, the soft scream of a pump, the predictable arc of water. Biscuit was not there. Biscuit preferred at-home kingliness. My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel, confirming that the trust paperwork had been accepted, and from Frank marking the times of Vanessa's routine bank visits. I breathed in to steady myself. The job site kept me honest. It reminded me of the simple physicality of making something real, a sensation I preferred to the theater of social drama. The water flowed, and I let it remind me why I had started the company in the first place. To build things that lasted longer than an insult. To leave a trace in the world that smelled faintly of jasmine and something tougher. Stone set in place. I knew there were risks. I knew that Vanessa's ego would bruise, and that she might fight back in ways that lawyers would have to anticipate. I knew that the family would fracture in the process. But there was nothing I could do about that would honor Harold's dignity more than what we were building. A sequence of documented steps, professionals enlisted, the right people told at the right time. The next morning, I sat with the binder Warren had prepared. It was a practical thing, staples and a tab for each year's transfers, a list of the shell entities, a map of where the money had gone. On top was a single photograph I had asked Frank to obtain. Harold, younger, planting a sapling in his yard. In the picture he was laughing. That was how I needed to remind myself he'd always been. Not a prop, not an easy target, but a man who had once lifted his shovel and dug into the earth because he believed in something. We had, in short order, done what had to be done, secured emergency funds, set up conservatorship paperwork to be ready in case Harold's cognition declined further, lined up the FBI contact, and compiled the documentation that would make a wire transfer's past legible. There is a peculiar satisfaction in seeing a tangled ball of financial movement laid out and understood. It feels less like victory than salvage, picking up the pieces before they're all gone. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday. Invitations had gone out. People RSVP'd. Vanessa texted me a photo of a dress she was considering, triumphant, unaware that some of the places she'd put her credit were now under examination. I replied with the sort of social nicety that passed for disarming a bomb. A photograph of a cake, a note about how I preferred vanilla, and a compliment on the way she'd laid out the spring arrangement last year. On the morning of the dinner, the city was mild, a good sort of day for a reveal. Not too hot to make people irritable, not too cold to numb their compassion. I checked my phone again. Jerome's text read succinctly, "We're ready to coordinate. Keep any staged conversation to minimal. Expect a low footprint from us at the proper moment. Don't create a theatrics liability." I closed the binder, slotted it into my briefcase, and ran my thumb along the edge of the Wattle Features stone on my way out. The riverfront had a way of swallowing small anxieties. It did not solve anything. It simply reminded me of work as a slow, honest process. I walked into the family kitchen where Harold sat, reading the paper with pastry crumbs on his lap. He looked up and smiled as if I'd just stopped by for tea. "You look tired," he said. "I am," I admitted. "But it's the good kind." He patted the seat beside him and set the paper aside. "You always did like fixing things," he said. And for a second, the old affection between us was plain as the wood table. "Doesn't mean the world's not trying to keep putting things in the wrong place." "No," I said, "it doesn't." We sat in companionable, sturdy silence for a moment, because everything worth salvaging benefits from a pause. That afternoon, while the house filled with the scent of baking, I checked the guest list one last time, folded the binder into the briefcase, and made sure the chain of custody for the documents was airtight. The professionals were in place. The people who had been cruel were polishing themselves for dinner. I felt like a seamstress who had finally found the right thread. I thought of the insult in the ballroom, Vanessa's laugh, the room's permission, and I thought of something else. The long, unromantic satisfaction of a job well done. I did not feel vindictive in a shouty way. I felt like someone who'd brought the proper people to a needed conversation. The law, not theatrics, would speak. Outside, the water feature at the riverfront continued to run. The basin glinted in the late sun the way a good project does. Not for show, but because the light makes a thing honest. I took a breath, and then another, and set the briefcase on my knee. If you want to hear how the dinner unfolded and what it feels like when systems you trust finally act, watch the next story on the screen now. The dining room smelled like roasted rosemary, and something buttery the caterer had insisted would pair well with nostalgia. Candles flickered in low glass votives. The table was laid with linen that softened the room into a living portrait of civility. Vanessa arrived early in a dress that caught the light the way she always wanted. Flattering, practiced, like a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to be remembered at parties. She perched at the head of the table as if she'd been born there. My hands were steady, partly because of the binder in my briefcase, and partly because I had spent too many years learning to be steady when other people weren't. I'd asked for a seat where I could see everyone without calling attention to myself. The corner next to Harold worked best. He wore the cardigan he preferred when he wanted to look casual and dignified at once. For a moment I watched him adjust the napkin at his lap, as if the ritual made the world make more sense. I smoothed my dress, the one I'd chosen because it didn't scream success and didn't read like defeat. Neutral armor. Biscuit would have approved, though he was asleep on the sofa at home, plotting some small domestic coup. Guests arrived like actors to a long-anticipated scene. Cousins who'd grown into different versions of themselves, a few old friends, Warren in a jacket that suggested confidence without effort. Rachel slipped in last. She had a look I now recognized as ready. Jerome's message the day before had been temperate but clear. Minimal visible law enforcement, maximum readiness behind the scenes. The plan was to let the professionals do their work quietly, while the family dinner played its small human notes. Conversation moved in predictable arcs: weather, grandchildren, a polite review of the gala. But under the niceties there were currents. I could feel the small shifts, a silence that lengthened when Vanessa smiled too brightly, a glance that landed on Harold's hands. The cake arrived, a modest vanilla with buttercream flowers half the size of a saucer, and Vanessa took her role as hostess seriously. She praised it because she loved applause for small things. I watched her do it and tucked that image away as evidence that performance could be precise. Warren did not speak until dessert, which is to say he didn't speak until most people were slightly distracted and less guarded. He'd called me a little earlier and asked for the floor. When he stood, he did so with the calmness of someone who'd seen worse than embarrassment and decided to name what mattered. "Before coffee," he said, in that low voice that had once gotten me a meeting in a mayor's office. "I'd like to say a few words about Harold." It was the sort of introduction that asked for attention without demanding drama. People straightened. Vanessa smiled, thinking the words would be another tribute. She might have been right in another universe. Warren pulled a thin stack of papers from his jacket, an auditor's printout, a summary, neat as a ledger's hymn. He put them on the table like a modest altar and met Harold's eyes. "Harold," he said, "you taught me how to plant a row of tomatoes so the city didn't look like an urban chest of weeds. You taught people to do things well. Tonight I want people to see that some of the things we do are built by hands and some by ink. For the last 2 years, some of Harold's ink has been repurposed without his knowledge." He let the sentence hang there long enough for the mustard in the conversation to settle. Vanessa's smile tightened. I felt her hand clutch the edge of the chair, like a woman checking the texture of a lie. Warren turned a page and read in a voice that was not theatrical, but was unmistakable. He described, matter-of-factly, the shell entities he'd traced, the inconsistent payments, the mortgage lien, the wire transfers in batches, the consulting invoices that made no consulting sense. He spoke of mechanisms, not motivations, what the money had done, not why someone might have been tempted. People shifted. My husband's jaw worked. He kept his gaze on the table as if reading the grain for clues. No one in that room was required to act. They were required only to listen. That was the legal and ethical line Rachel had insisted upon. Present the facts, let the law do the moving. At the end of Warren's quiet reading, I felt a small exhale roll through the room. Someone, an old neighbor and ally of Harold's, asked a simple question. "So what happens now?" This is where the choreography mattered. Jerome had told me to expect minimal visible law enforcement, and Rachel had reminded me that the prosecutor's office required a chain of custody and witnesses who had not been coerced. What came next needed to be orderly, unimpeachable. A man in a suit, whose badge was tucked discreetly beneath his lapel, stood and introduced himself as Agent Williams. He wore no cowboy swagger. He wore the patient calm of someone who had made a career of watching patterns gather like storm clouds and then knowing which ones carried hail. He explained briefly and precisely that a federal investigation had been initiated based on the documents Warren and Frank had provided, that his team had secured a warrant pending certain procedural items, that they were there to ensure the safety of Harold and the integrity of the evidence. Vanessa's face flushed. For a moment she searched for her laugh, the lubricant that had always made embarrassment slide away. She did not find it. Agent Williams asked Vanessa, if she would come speak with him privately for a moment to answer a few routine questions. Rachel had advised that they would be afforded procedural respect. Rachel had also reminded us that suspects frequently complied when confronted with the weight of documented paper. Vanessa hesitated long enough for the room to realize something was different, and then followed the agent down the hallway. I watched her shoulders walk away from the table like someone leaving a stage. There was no dramatic clanging of gavel, no handcuffs flashed for the cameras. That was not how the professionals worked, and it was not what any of us wanted. We wanted precision. We wanted to avoid the melodrama. Attorneys warned could make a case defensible instead of true. A phone buzzed softly. My husband's hand found mine under the table. He squeezed, an almost apologetic gesture, as if the squeeze could stitch up an old indifference. He looked tired, suddenly mortal in a way I'd been reluctant to allow him to be. For a while he had assumed family loyalty was a shield. It had been a blindfold. Vanessa returned 30 minutes later, escorted by a pair of officers who walked with professional courtesy. She sat down very carefully, as if afraid the chair might betray her. The conversation following was low, the kind of exchange that felt like paper scratching on a courtroom pad. Jerome and his team needed statements from those who had noticed anomalies. They needed witness testimony. Someone had to demonstrate the timeline, when Harold's signature started to look different on documents, when the transfers had begun, when the mortgage lien had appeared. People answered. We told the truth. After the room had emptied into a collective calm, Agent Williams asked to speak with me in the kitchen where the coffee pot still hummed. He explained quietly that some assets tied to the shell entities had been frozen and that a temporary hold had been placed on certain corporate accounts. We filed for temporary injunctive relief, he said, careful with his words. My brain translated, assets frozen, not ours to access right now, an instruction that meant painstaking accounting and a cooperation rhythm Rachel would choreograph. We'll need you to continue to be candid and to keep all communications with Vanessa limited, he said. Anything you send, texts, phone calls, may be used in the investigation. Keep the professionals in the loop. I nodded. It felt good to be in a conversation that used language of evidence rather than accusation. It felt good because it meant the system we'd called on was functioning with the dignity we'd asked of it. There was no cinematic shouted confession that night. There was paperwork, and there was the small cruelty of bureaucracy. Forms to file, statements to sign, affidavits to notarize. We moved through each task like careful surgeons. Rachel held my hand throughout, figuratively, guiding me through signatures and retention schedules. Frank added last-minute notes to his surveillance logs. Warren sent copies of the banker's notes he'd kept for years like a ledger of intuition. Vanessa continued to put up a face that suggested she was surprised and wronged, as if being accused were the highest possible insult to her curated persona. There was no sudden admission. Many people who commit fraud do not do so with what we imagine as cinematic villainy. They do so with rationalizations and habit, with small steps that become a staircase to something monstrous. The law handles patterns. People handle the moral aftermath. After the agents left that night, Harold asked to be driven home. He walked with a small stoop I'd learned to read as both fragility and oddly courageous perseverance. He took my hand in the driveway, and in the way of old men who believe in modest truths, said, "Thank you for sticking with me tonight, Susie." I told him the truth. I'm not leaving. He looked at me then, not at my company, not at my bank account, not at my ability to adjudicate family dramas, but at me. "You've always been a good one to hold a shovel," he said, and the phrase landed like an honest stone in a pond. We laughed, small and private, and I drove him home. In the weeks that followed, life reorganized itself around necessities. The press wanted details, and Rachel fielded calls with practiced restraint, confirming only that a federal investigation was underway. that charges had been filed, that the integrity of Harold's accounts was being preserved. People in town whispered at the beauty supply, over the fence, in grocery aisles. Some offered congratulations. Others wondered openly how family ties had been transformed into legal actions. The rumor mill did what rumor mills do. It rehabilitated their version of reality faster than we could set the facts on a table. We dealt with assets being frozen, which has a particular logistical sting. The trust we'd set up for Harold had been a temporary bridge. When the shell accounts were placed under court hold, bills needed paying, the mortgage needed attention, and the caretaker's wages could not wait. That was the practical use of company reserves, not to boast, but to act. We operated transparently. Company invoices for services performed, written contracts for caretaker work, documented loans to Harold's trust with explicit terms to be reconciled once the court allowed. Rachel approved each movement and stamped each page into the file that was growing like a small legal tree. There were hearings, administrative, dry, and necessary, where attorneys argued the admissibility of documents and the timing of the transfers. Jerome and his team coordinated with state prosecutors to tie the local misappropriation to a broader pattern of movements across state lines. We presented stacks of bank statements that made the path of each wire painfully visible. Defense counsel suggested ordinary explanations: accounting errors, miscommunication, consent. Those arguments were met with corroboration. Handwriting analysis that showed Harold's signature had degraded in ways consistent with cognitive decline, depositions of bankers who testified to unusual instructions, and a sequence of transfers that corroborated the pattern we'd identified. Throughout this, Vanessa maintained a posture of wounded dignity. That posture was a shield against the shame of being called to account. In a culture that always allows for smiles to cover things, she aimed to live behind hers. When the judge approved temporary freezes on specific accounts, and the court assigned an independent conservator to oversee Harold's finances, Vanessa's expression briefly flickered, an admission, perhaps, of being stopped by a mechanism she used to steer. The community reaction was complicated. Some neighbors applauded me quietly at the hardware store, handing me folded notes that said, "Thank you for looking out for Harold." Others were kinder in the kitchen than they had been in the past, as if their tone had been softened by understanding. A few old friends who'd grown up with Vanessa expressed disbelief. Those were difficult conversations. Empathy is a complicated muscle to use when someone you love is accused of grave things. I tried, where it was possible and not harmful, to hold the line between explanation and performative victory. Vanessa, for her part, eventually filed motions and retained counsel. She contested certain findings, as is her right. The law moves through motions and timelines, claim and counterclaim. Jerome never promised me a particular outcome. He promised adherence to process, and process is how we protect the truth from being shouted away. There were private moments that the news never captured. I visited Harold regularly. We drove to the riverfront and watched the water feature we'd restored ripple under a late sun. The pump hummed its steady song, and the stones, slicked with a careful hand, glowed like old coins. He would sit on the bench near the basin and point to particular plants in ways that suggested his memory chose what to keep as if it were a garden and he were picking his favorites. Those visits were, to me, the whole point. One afternoon, Vanessa appeared at the front gate of Harold's house unannounced. She wore a sweater and had a folder under her arm. She asked if she might speak to him in the garden. My initial instinct, trained by years of contingency planning and legal caution, was to say no. But Harold, who retained an enormous capacity to be kind even when betrayed, nodded before I could formulate my objection. They spoke in the shade beneath the maple. I could not hear all that passed, but I watched Vanessa's hands as she talked. They were less theatrical than before, and once in a while she reached across the small distance between them and patted Harold's arm in a way that read like apology without words. When she returned to the gate, she looked at me, no smile, no performance, and said quietly, "I wanted him to know I cared." It was the sort of admission that did not absolve her of what had been found, but did suggest a human complexity that many people contain. I never allowed myself a private victory dance. That is not my way. I allowed gratitude for the system used properly, Jerome and his team, Rachel's exacting mind, Frank's patience, Warren's less obvious generosity. I allowed a sober satisfaction in the thought that a life was being steadied. I allowed the possibility of a cautious thaw in the relationship with Vanessa, should she ever demonstrate accountability beyond a passing word. There are boundaries that cannot be crossed back. There are places where forgiveness must wait until restitution is exacted and the hurt is repaired in material ways. Material restitution came in forms that were neither quick nor simple. The frozen assets required petitions to release funds for necessary expenses. The courts identified legitimate claims and directed partial releases to pay for Harold's immediate needs and for the conservator to manage his ongoing care. Where funds remained missing, the civil process enabled claims against remaining assets. We sought recovery, not revenge. That meant long days in the courthouse and evenings spent arranging for caretakers, medication management, and home safety assessments. Rachel and the conservator coordinated to ensure Harold's income streams were protected and directed toward his welfare. There were conversations at my company about how we would proceed. Some of the staff were surprised when I told them how much of the company's reserves we'd used temporarily to secure Harold's needs. I explained the principle. We are custodians of more than stormwater plans and planting schemes. We are also custodians of the families we serve. The bookkeeping team tracked every cent, and when the court allowed, we invoiced the trust for legitimate services rendered. Everything had a paper trail. Everything was defensible. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were grinding, steady work. There were depositions where I sat for hours under fluorescent lights, telling the same truth in ways that lawyers could weave into a single narrative. There were days when I wondered how much of my life I would have to give to paperwork. There were nights when I sat at the riverfront and let the pump's soft rattle be a metronome to my thoughts. And there were moments of light. One afternoon, we received a notice that a small portion of the misdirected funds had been recovered through an estate account managed by a third party who'd been unwittingly entangled in the transfers. The amount was not everything, but it was tangible and real. It paid down an outstanding medical bill and brought a sense of rightness to something that had been unmoored. Harold's health mercifully stabilized in a way that allowed him to enjoy small pleasures. He took to calling me when the sparrows arrived at his feeder. He remembered the names of local masons and pointed out a brickwork repair in a neighbor's wall with pleasure. His laughter returned in small waves. Each return brought me relief that was complicated by a trace of sadness for time lost. My marriage also adjusted. My husband had always been a quiet kind of person, someone who expressed love in domestic ways rather than grand speeches. He learned to read documents and to sit at hearings. He learned the particular grammar of legal caution. We argued sometimes about how public to be, about how much to involve the family. But we also learned to align. He began accompanying me to some meetings, not as a principal, but as someone who had been brought into the map late and now wanted to be useful where he could. The company continued to operate. We completed municipal bids and finished the riverfront restoration ahead of schedule. I walked job sites with my boots caked as I always had, feeling at home in the grit of the work. The water feature we had restored sang every day. One afternoon, while overseeing a planting scheme, my phone lit up with a call from a potential client who'd seen the riverfront piece and wanted to commission a schoolyard redesign. I took the call standing in the dirt and felt a steady satisfaction that had nothing to do with headlines. Time, in its patient way, shifted the shape of things. The court docket continued its slow machinery. Hearings, motions, discovery exchanges. Charges remained filed. Assets remained under various holds. A civil suit sought to recover damages. The criminal process took its course with the procedural caution of a system that does not like to rush when liberty and reputations are at stake. I stopped telling myself I could know the end. Instead, I focused on the next right thing. Harold's care, the conservator's reports, the company's payroll, the staff who relied on me. Vanessa, over time, reached out in small ways. Letters mediated through counsel, an offer to pay for certain services which, in the fashion of legal advice, came with strings and conditions that Rachel and I passed with care. I read one letter in my office with the city map pinned on the wall. The letter was not an apology. It was a defensive reach that acknowledged harm without naming culpability. I forwarded it to Rachel and put it in a file labeled Records. Sometimes later I would find myself perusing a photograph of Harold planting the sapling and thinking about how people can both contain tenderness and cause harm. I did not rush to punish or to forgive. I moved by small, pragmatic steps. There was one meeting months after the initial arrest when Vanessa asked, through counsel, if she might see Harold. The request came with conditions that smelled of strategy. Rachel suggested a monitored visit. Harold, always magnanimous in ways that make me both proud and furious, wanted to see her, not because he trusted her, but because he thought life might be easier if people could find a way to coexist on the map of daily life. We arranged the visit in the presence of the conservator and in a room where the exchange could be documented. Vanessa sat across from Harold, and for a period there was an odd, brittle politeness. Harold patted her hand once. She did not cry. She said little. The visit ended without drama, and Harold seemed both pleased and tired. When I stepped outside after the meeting, I felt exhausted in a way that had little to do with winning. It had to do with caring so much that falsehoods required the institution of law to protect the people you loved. It had to do with the realization that trust, once cracked, demands careful work to mend. I returned to the riverfront, where the water feature sang the same small song it had sung before this all began. The pump hummed, the stones glistened, and the plants we'd selected for resilience flexed against wind and sun. On the bench by the basin, a family had spread a picnic blanket, and their child, tiny, exuberant, had pressed little muddy hands into the shallow spillway and laughed when the water tickled his fingers. The child's delight felt like absolution in a small, world-sized way. It reminded me why I did this work, to create spaces where people could feel something wholly human without calculation. There were offers to speak publicly, news segments, local television, a few op-eds. Rachel counseled restraint. Jerome suggested careful framing. I did one interview with a local paper where I emphasized process and protection. How legal structures, when used properly, can guard elders against exploitation. How community vigilance matters. How professional help should be sought early. The piece did not go viral. It did something more useful. It made a few people call their elderly neighbors to ask about their banking. When the initial shock settled, the company grew. We won another bid for a municipal park, and the children who ran around the new playground brought a different sort of applause. At the ribbon cutting, I stood in sneakers and mud, and someone thanked me for making a place where their kids could play without worry. Those thanks felt purer than any social accolade at a gala. They were the kind of approval that arises from work that matters. Over the course of a year, the legal machinery continued. Some assets were returned to the estate, others remained entangled in litigation. The conservator issued regular reports that satisfied the court. Vanessa's attorney attempted to negotiate settlements, and in the civil arena, some arrangements were made to reimburse certain costs. No dramatic final chapter ever arrived on a single headline. What came instead was the slow, difficult business of restoration. Accounts balanced, liens cleared, bills paid, caregivers hired, medication schedules created, and Harold's days full of small, ordinary pleasures. In quieter moments, I would think about the way men and women like Warren and Jerome and Rachel toil in anonymity to make sure that the law is not just a concept, but a working instrument. I thought about Frank, who sat in cars and logged details the way some people log prayers. I thought about the dozen people on my payroll who trusted me to bring home work and steady pay. I thought about my husband, whose hands had once trembled with indecision, and who had learned slowly and painfully to be present. There is a particular kind of humility that comes with not being shouted into victory. You learn to carry the small satisfactions. Warm bread at morning meetings, a call from a grateful client, Harold's hand finding yours on the porch. You learn to be patient with the slow drip of legal process and the slow bloom of genuine accountability. One afternoon, nearly a year after Vanessa's initial public humiliation of me, I was at the job site, leaning over a newly planted bed of native perennials. The city had asked us to design a rain garden that would absorb runoff and give children a place to observe frogs and dragonflies. I knelt in the soil, fingers in the dirt, and felt the familiar ache of a person who had spent their life building. A foreman shouted across the site about a delivery. The pump at the riverfront purred on my phone's status feed. No disruption, running clean. My phone vibrated. It was an email from a publishing house that had seen the local article and wanted to commission a short piece on community-based landscape projects. I answered after I finished the row of plants, my hands marked with soil, and felt a genuine smile lift my face. For a tiny moment I considered the contrast. The ballroom with its champagne glasses frozen in mid-toast, and this muddy, honest place where life and work met. Harold called that evening from his chair by the window. "Do you remember the maple?" he asked, referring to the tree he'd planted decades ago. "I do," I said. "It's doing well. Strong roots." "Good," he said. "Good. You gave it a good home." "I tried," I replied. And he laughed in the kind way old men do when they hear a truth they've always known. "You did more than try," he added. "You made something that mattered." The legal landscape remained complex. The criminal case moved forward in its own time. The civil suit whistled slowly through mediation and settlement discussions. I learned to file motions in my mind and then set them down, because there were not enough hours in the day to hold every legal worry and still be present for the people I loved. One autumn evening, Vanessa sent a note, this time not through counsel, but with a personal page of apology that sounded in places almost sincere. She admitted confusion, apologized for discomfort her actions had caused, and wrote that she wished Harold well. I put the note in a small box of correspondence I kept for records, and for the day when the threads might be reconvened with better honesty. I did not rush to respond. Part of restoration is time and accountability. Apology without change is not reconciliation. I returned again and again to the places that had kept me steady. The riverfront, the job site, the company office where my staff laughed and argued about plant choices like people who knew a life's work was in their hands. Each little scene tethered me to the truth that dignity is repaired by facts and by care. Sometimes people ask me how I felt the night Vanessa insulted me. The answer is never simple. I felt the sharpness of public humiliation like a cut, and I felt, simultaneously, the strange quiet satisfaction of knowing I had a toolbox no one expected me to have. That toolbox included people: Warren, Rachel, Frank, Jerome, and a set of skills I'd earned through years of practice. It did not include revenge. It included patience, procedure, and the will to use institutions built to protect rather than to punish for the sake of spectacle. We learned something important, that justice is not a dramatic reveal, but a slow alignment of documents, testimony, and legal motion. It is patience married to insistence. It is, in the end, human work. It was less catharsis than repair. On a bright morning 2 springs after the gala, I walked the riverfront with Harold on a loose leash of memory and care. The water feature glinted like the same honest coin it had always been. Children darted around the plantings we had chosen for resilience. Their laughter threaded the air like an honest song. I watched Harold point at a dragonfly, and then at the roots of a plant we'd installed, proud in a way that had nothing to do with bank accounts. "You did good," he said, looking at me without fanfare. "You kept the right things." I had kept the right things, I thought. Not a marriage's ceremonies or the approval of a ballroom, but the well-being of a man who had been family to me. I had not done it alone. I had done it with good counsel, meticulous evidence, and a willingness to be patient enough for institutions to act. There was no triumphant podium. There was instead a bench, a pump, a handful of children, and a man who would remember the taste of his tea and the names of the birds. That, to me, was the kind of victory that mattered. If this story resonated with you, please watch another video on the screen now. There are more stories about people who rebuild quietly and steadily after being underestimated.